Bishop Dushi, Vicar of the Cathedral, all the clergy present today, ladies and gentlemen. I also see some boys and girls from schools. Welcome to the oration. The topic of climate change is very topical these days. There's hardly any news bulletin that we see today where the subject isn't being talked about. And I'm normally talking to an audience of directors of companies and MBA students, but this is a slightly different audience. So as opposed to using technical jargon, I will try to keep the subject as simple as possible so that every one of you will understand the subject and be able to take home some important thoughts at the end of today's session. My first objective is to create awareness of climate change and how it manifests to each of us. And I'm going to spend some time doing that because I believe that if I do that properly, then the challenge of addressing those issues will happen conveniently and quickly. So what is climate change and how does it manifest to us? Number two, I will look at what causes climate change. Because between 1880 and 2023, we have seen in the last 143 years, global climates have changed dramatically, and it has basically come to a stage where economic devastation is what we are now beginning to experience all over the world. So should the church respond, and if so, can the church be part of the solution to the climate emergency? That is my agenda. But before we get into the subject of climate change, I did a bit of research on the Bishop Cyril Abenayaka. And here are a few quips and quotes that I picked up as I did the research. First and foremost, he was lovingly known as the priest of the slums. And what that tells me is here was a priest who was engaging with the poor in Sri Lanka. He held the office of bishop, the 10th Bishop of Colombo between 1971 and 77. And it is said that he was always conscious that his direction came from God, which is, I thought, a very poignant point. I picked up a quote from his, which I think could be applied to Sri Lanka today. And it says, Sri Lanka seems to be crisis-ridden. Several crises, political, social, economic, cultural, racial and industrial, which took several centuries in Europe, have been telescoped over here into 30 years. And as I look at the kind of challenges Sri Lanka has gone through in the last 1.5 to 2 years, it seems like the problems of Europe have all been telescoped into a very short period. But this was the line that inspired me. It says, but we Christians need not be crisis-ridden as we have Christ ruled, as we are Christ ruled. And I thought, what an amazing statement. A few other points about Bishop Cyril. He had his education at Royal College. He did a degree in history at the University of Colombo. And at King's College, University of London, he read theology for his degree. Now, I must confess, I have not read theology for any degree. And today's, what I share with all of you will be from my area of expertise, which is in sustainability. It also goes on to say his humility is an object lesson to all, and very few with his intellect would suffer fools and knaves as readily. Humility of a great leader of the country. The cathedral in Colombo was initiated by Bishop Harold de Souza and completed by Bishop Abhenayaka. With much yearning and concentration, he consecrated this house of worship on November 7th, 1973. The last point I picked up from my research was that he mentions Christians must participate in joint action and solidarity. And I think this is a nice segue for me to move into my subject, which is climate change. Because I believe today the church, globally and locally, globally because 1/6 of the world's population confess to be Christians, there's an opportunity for the church to be involved in being a solution to the climate emergency. The government of Sri Lanka in 2015 December made a commitment at the Paris Agreement. And the commitment was that Sri Lanka would move towards being 70% driven by renewable energy sources by 2030. We are now in 2023 and the current figure is 30%. So we've got to double and add 10% by 2030. That is not a commitment the government of Sri Lanka will be able to make if it tries to achieve that on its own. Nor is it something that can be achieved without the total motivation and inspiration of every Sri Lankan. And I believe the church, therefore, has a key role to play in this key commitment that Sri Lanka has made. So, a very crowded slide, but I'm going to highlight the key points out of this. So, what does climate change really mean? And how does it impact you and me? I've highlighted a few points and I'm going to talk to you about each of them. And I'm going to keep it as simple and non-technical as possible. So the first way climate change manifests to every single one of us is through global warming. In other words, a warmer and a hotter planet. And I will give you some facts and data about that as we move on. Number 2, more frequent and intense extreme weather events. And once again, I will give you some facts and data about how extreme weather events are beginning to pummel the planet in a manner that we have never seen before. And I urge all of you at the end of this session to maybe spend a little more time watching the weather forecasts on all the channels, or at least one channel of your choice, a global channel, because you'll begin to realize the kind of devastation extreme weather events are now meting out to the planet. More wildfires. It was not too long ago where we heard that Australia had one of the worst wildfires ever known, where they lost nearly 3 billion animals during that wildfire in Australia. And wildfires are now happening almost sporadically in every other country. An increased conflict over natural resources is one of the issues that we will also be faced going forward. Decreased access to clean water, and last but not least, it says sea level rise and floods. So, are sea levels really rising? Is there any issue with that? So let's delve into this subject a little deeper in terms of how climate change manifests to each of us. And here are some temperature readings in the last 6 to 8 months globally. It is quite stunning to note that in the last 6 to 8 months, country after country are registering its highest ever temperatures in its history. So I've started with a town in China which registered 44.2 degrees centigrade, We move on to Europe. We see Italy reaching 40.7 degrees centigrade. Now we think 32 degrees is hot. Now just think about 44 degrees and 40 degrees. In Tunisia, 47.8 degrees. Europe, this year and last year, London hit 42.4 degrees centigrade. Germany, 39. Thailand, a couple of days back, on the 14th of April this year, hit 45.4 degrees centigrade. And Vietnam hit 43.5 degrees centigrade and 44.1 degrees in Laos. Japan, 40.2 degrees centigrade. The first manifestation of climate change is where we begin to see a warmer planet, a hotter planet, and country after country are now beginning to register the hottest ever temperatures in their history. And in the case of most of these townships I have mentioned, the temperatures were the hottest ever recorded in history. So the planet is getting hotter. Why is it getting hotter? The next manifestation is unprecedented flooding in most countries. And it was not too long ago we saw a devastating flood in Pakistan, which displaced 20 million people in a nation of 100 million, about 80 million. And this was one of the worst ever devastations we've seen in recent times. And now when we talk about flooding, we talk about 2 months rain happening in 1 hour. And you can see almost every city in the planet has begun to experience unprecedented flooding events. So, is that a big deal? Let's look at some numbers. If you look at the years 1980 to 1999, the average number of extreme weather incidents that hit the planet was about 350 incidents. However, we move forward to 2000 to 2019, this figure has doubled. It's nearly 600 to 700 incidents per annum. And the majority of these incidents are floods, storms, and extreme temperatures. So, ladies and gentlemen, the first and important manifestation of climate change is we are beginning to experience extreme weather events which are beginning to have devastating effects in terms of humanity. Now, how devastating are these floods that we are having? So the Secretary General of the United Nations this month said some very scary words. The first thing he said was, the alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. Number two, he said greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel burning and deforestation are choking our planet and putting billions of people at immediate risk. From fossil fuel burning, and that's the key point I want to make today. Number three, global heating is affecting every region on Earth and many of the changes becoming irreversible. But of all the things that the Secretary General of the UN said, this last line, I think, captures his feelings about what is happening on the planet today very succinctly. What did he say? He said, world leaders are driving the planet with the foot on the accelerator to climate hell. To climate hell. As we are having this event in a holy place like a church, driving the planet with the foot on the accelerator to climate hell is quite a scary thought. And he goes on to say, there's a code red for humanity, and he refers to a report that came out recently, and he says, this report should sound a death knell for coal and fossil fuels before they destroy our planet. The key point at this stage that I want to make is, so what is causing this unprecedented heating of the planet, the unprecedented extreme weather incidents that we are faced with, and the devastation of economies? And that is, the cause is burning of fossil fuels. So let's just spend a moment on what are these fossil fuels that they're talking about. The key fossil fuels that are causing the climate emergency are, number one, coal. The more coal we burn, for every gigawatt hour of electricity coal generates, it releases to the atmosphere 820 tons of carbon dioxide. Now don't worry too much about these numbers, but I'm hoping the younger generation will remember the number 820 tons of carbon dioxide. Oil and petroleum and diesel releases 720 tons of carbon dioxide. And natural gas, even though people refer to it as natural gas, I can tell you natural gas is a fossil fuel, and the three fossil fuels that are causing havoc in the planet today are coal, all petroleum products, and natural gas. And they release between 490 and 720 tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas which traps the sunlight, and therefore we have the kind of warming that you and I are now experiencing. Now look at the renewable energy side, the options we have versus fossil fuels. Hydropower. I think the bells couldn't have rung at a better time than that. Just when we are talking about the cause of climate change and also the opportunities of moving from fossil fuels, which are releasing between 200 to 800 tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, versus the renewable energy side of hydropower, nuclear, wind and solar, which release between 3 tons and 30 tons. That's the difference. And that is the key message, first key message every one of us should understand. If we keep burning fossil fuels, we are releasing between 300 to 800 tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. If we move to renewable energy, we are releasing between 3 tons and 30 tons. And that alone is enough evidence that we ought to be all moving towards renewable energy sources. So what is Sri Lanka's energy mix? That is the next key point we need to discuss. Today, 70% of Sri Lanka's energy or electricity comes from fossil fuels, coal, petroleum and diesel. And that is not a very good thing, because 70% of it is contributing a tremendous amount of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. There is 30% coming from renewable energy sources, which is a good thing. But here's the catch. Out of the 30% of energy we deliver to the grid from renewable energy sources, 29% comes from hydroelectricity and only 1% comes from solar. Now that is quite a stunning figure for a country which has 360 days of solar power, where the sun is shining pretty brightly. And the more I think about the sun, the more I'm convinced that the Creator already gave us an energy source which we have decided not to tap into. And a country like Sri Lanka with almost 360 days of sunlight should have been probably the other way around. 70% of our energy should have been coming from renewable energy sources like solar. So the cause of the climate emergency that you and I are beginning to experience in the planet today, in the world today, is the constant burning of fossil fuels. And this burning of fossil fuels started in 1880, 143 years back. In 1880, the world discovered coal, as they call it, and since then we have doubled and trebled the amount of fossil fuels we have burned, which has caused the climate emergency. Sadly, the two big nations in the world today, in terms of energy, China and India, 70% of India's current energy sources are fossil fuels. Sri Lanka, I already said, is 70%. And in China, it's 61%. So we have a situation where these unprecedented figures of 70% coming from fossil fuels have to move to renewable energy if we want to in any way control the climate emergency that is pummeling the planet today. So every year in Davos, the world's leaders get together and decide and discuss and zero in on what are the major global risks the planet is facing every year. And the best and brightest minds in terms of the world, in terms of world leaders, all gather in Davos to try and establish what are the number 1, 2, and 3 crises and risks to the world. And I hope every one of you remember these 3 risks, because this was decided in February this year in Davos. The first risk that they highlighted was a failure to mitigate climate change. So a failure to prevent climate change is the first risk they see. The second risk is a failure to adapt to climate change. And the third risk is extreme weather incidents. So I'm going to start with the third and graduate to the second and the first. If we look at the losses to the global economy due to extreme weather incidents, in the 70s, the average loss was $17.5 billion per annum. Fast forward to 2020, 2022, from $17 billion of economic loss, we are now losing $270 billion every year due to extreme weather incidents. Now that is a significant loss in terms of economic welfare. And the sad news is that this could have been avoided if leaders hadn't failed us in terms of leading the world towards moving towards renewable energy much faster. So when they use the word failure, they are using it in terms of failure of leaders. Leaders of nations, leaders of business, and all leaders who have any stewardship in terms of leading anyone in the planet. And failure of leaders, let's see if this is fact or fiction. I already said that for 143 years we have now been burning fossil fuels, but when knowing that fossil fuels is the cause of the climate emergency, world leaders subsidize fossil fuels so that we can actually buy fossil fuels cheaper. And that is a bit like saying, if extra sugar causes diabetes, that's like the leaders getting together and saying, we'll now give sugar 25% cheaper so that all of you can get diabetes much faster. And that is sadly how world leaders have been handling the climate emergency. Subsidizing fossil fuels to the tune of $5.9 trillion, which works out to about $168,000 per second, to subsidize fossil fuels so that you and I can burn more fossil fuels and cause a bigger problem to the planet. So is that leadership? So when did we know that burning fossil fuels causes the climate emergency? It was in 1987, 36 years ago, the United Nations commissioned a report, and they appointed the then Norwegian Prime Minister, Brundtland, to look at what was happening with the climate emergency in the world. And she presented a report titled, Our Common Future. And everything we know about burning fossil fuels, the planet getting warmer, the extreme weather incidents is all captured in that report in 1987. Now, between 1987 and 2023, what have world leaders done? There is a chart with all the meetings that they've been holding to discuss the climate emergency. But the only thing that happened at almost every one of these meetings is they delayed taking action on moving away from fossil fuels. In 1992, there was a big conference in Rio de Janeiro called the Earth Conference, and nearly 196 leaders said we must exit fossil fuels by the year 2000. Nothing happened. Then we fast forward to 2015, the Paris Agreement, where every country committed to moving towards renewable energy, like Sri Lanka. And guess what happened? When we get close to 2030, the meeting has said, no, let's do this by 2070. So the targets for exiting fossil fuels have moved from the year 2000 to the year 2030, and now we are talking of 2070. Recently, in the last 1.5 years, we have seen world leaders denying science. And one of the major causes for this crisis is that for the last 36 years, leader after leader of nation after nation, business after business, have been ignoring the science. Because if they listened to the science that was presented in 1987, we would have by now been very advanced in renewable energy use. In the USA, we had a leader who said, we can take Lysol if you have COVID. He also exited the Paris Agreement. A leader of the most advanced nation on the planet advising people on how to fight COVID-19, denying the science. Australia had a leader who decided that the future of Australia is burning more coal. He was fortunately voted out of power recently. UK had a leader who was given 37 days as a prime minister. She too started giving fossil fuel exploration certificates and is no longer in a job. In Brazil, the leader of Brazil, Bolsonaro, basically contributed to the biggest destruction of the Amazon rainforest in its history. And basically, he's someone who has denied even the COVID-19 crisis. The two countries with the most number of COVID deaths on the planet are, number one, USA, number 2, Brazil. Now do you see a pattern of science denial? These were the two countries we had leaders who denied science. And this, recently we had the head of the World Bank who also denied science and was quickly replaced within months of his denial. A new World Bank head has been appointed. The reason I'm sharing this with you is today the world is facing this climate emergency because for 37 years, world leaders have ignored the climate emergency and not taken the actions needed to move rapidly into renewables. So let's listen to one of the most important leaders of this subject on this subject of climate change.
Dear colleague friends, we're taking colossal risks with the future of civilization on Earth. We're degrading life support systems that we all depend on. We're actually pushing the entire Earth system to a point of destabilization, pushing Earth outside of the state that has supported civilization since we left the last ice age 10,000 years ago. This requires a transformation to safe and just Earth system boundaries for the whole world economy. The question is, why? These are the 16 tipping elements, the large biophysical systems that we have scientific evidence that regulates the state of the entire climate system on Earth. 9 of these 16 are showing signs of instability. Push them too far, and they will shift over from supporting humanity to start to undermine humanity. 4 of these are showing scientific evidence of now being at risk already at 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're approaching this point very rapidly. 2 of them, the Greenland ice sheet and the West Atlantic ice sheet, together represent 10 meters sea level rise. This shows scientifically that 1.5 degrees Celsius is a physical limit. It is not a political target. But what I say next will be the most alarming thing. We have more and more scientific evidence of connectivity between these tipping elements. Cascade risks of dominoes. Let me give you one example. Here's the one that is most researched. Greenland ice sheet, accelerated melting, warming 4 times faster than the planet as a whole, releasing cold fresh water, slowing down the overturning of heat in the North Atlantic, pushing the whole monsoon system down further south, causing droughts and forest fires over the Amazon rainforest, one more tipping element system, locking warm surface water in the Southern Ocean, accelerating the melting of the West Atlantic ice sheet. The North Pole is connected to the South Pole in regulating the stability of the entire Earth system. Dear friends, scientifically, this is not a climate crisis. We are now facing something deeper. Mass extinction, air pollution, undermining ecosystem functions, really putting humanity's future at risk. This is a planetary crisis.
If you listen to that video, Johan Rockström is somebody who you can watch on Netflix. There is a documentary called Breaking Boundaries. Watch this video, watch this Netflix documentary, because the gentleman is probably the person who has researched climate emergency most in the world. He talked of a 10-meter sea level rise. So I'm not even talking of 10 meters, I'm talking of about 6 meters sea level rise. I'm not going into too much detail of scaring all of you with 10-meter sea level rise. But between January 2013 and December 2022, we've already had a 4.62 millimeter sea level rise. And sea level rise is going to be an obvious outcome as the North Pole and the South Pole begin to melt, because that water has to go somewhere. And we are looking at probably a 20-foot sea level rise. Sri Lanka has already experienced a 20-foot sea level rise during the tsunami. What's the difference between this sea level rise and what we had in the tsunami? In the tsunami, the 20-foot sea level rise happened and it went back within seconds. Now think of a 20-foot sea level rise that stays there. Now if you think all what I've said doesn't really apply to Sri Lanka, there is a government website called Blue Green Era. If you go to the government website, every city in Sri Lanka is mapped out in terms of sea level rise and the impact of sea level rise, so you can decide whether everything I've said so far is fact or fiction, because this is in the government website. So here what you see is a good part of Colombo, Jayala, Kandana, Velisada, even Katunayaka pretty much getting inundated with water. And if we cross the 4 degrees centigrade, then we'll have to bring seaplanes to our airports, because we are going to see an unprecedented sea level rise beginning to hit the coastal belt of Sri Lanka. How has Sri Lanka done with its forest cover? Today, we have a country that is left with 16% forest cover. In other words, we have destroyed 84% of our forest cover. The global average is 30%. Sri Lanka is 16%. So, in the name of development, we have destroyed a lot of the forest cover. And if we continue to do that, we will have the water cycle getting jeopardized, and that is the future. So I want to get into very quickly, so what can we do about everything that I have shared so far? Every one of us is basically measured by the word carbon footprint. Every one of us have a carbon footprint. Every household has a carbon footprint. Every business has a carbon footprint. And every church has a carbon footprint. And every nation has a carbon footprint. So what is the carbon footprint of our church? The carbon footprint of our church is the sum of all emissions of carbon dioxide by using fossil fuels, which were induced by the church's activities in a given time frame. And the same is true for our personal activities and our personal life. So the measurement is carbon emissions, because carbon dioxide emissions are because we continuously burn fossil fuels. So if I was to break that down in a more simpler manner, the total electricity consumption of the church, plus its water consumption, plus the petrol and diesel and whatever we spend to come to church, is also part of the carbon emissions of the church, and other costs. Our objective has to be to reduce and move towards renewable energy sources, and that, ladies and gentlemen, should be the main message that is coming out of this whole presentation, because the global climate emergency is a fossil fuel crisis. If we move out of fossil fuels and move to the renewables, then we have a chance. So what we have done so far is to create awareness of the problem, what causes it, and I am also saying basically the climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis. How is it that even though we have known fossil fuels is the cause of the climate emergency, how is it that world leaders have ignored it? And the reason for that is because either the world leaders ignored science, or they were influenced by the fossil fuel industry not to exit fossil fuels. It's a combination of both these things. So what can we do moving forward? The Pope had this to say in his encyclical letter. He says, "Planet Earth now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use of the planet. We have forgotten that we ourselves were dust of the earth." So here are three possible interventions all of us can begin to work on, whether it is our church, whether it is our home, whether it is our school, and I can see that quite a few good schools are represented here. So, I believe that the first responsibility of any organization is to first create awareness of the climate emergency and make sure that we build leaders who understand that you cannot ignore science and be a leader at the same time. I would go to the extent, especially to the younger generation here, who are probably looking at your A-levels or looking at your university degrees. I can tell you that any one of you doing STEM subjects, science included, are going to be a very, very important resource going forward in the world. And I think creating awareness amongst our leadership is maybe the first thing we have to do. And creating awareness of what I have shared with you up till now. Number two, we need to harness the sun. And when I say harness the sun, I say no roof left behind. We should not be leaving any roof that is not working for us in terms of renewable energy sources. And I can tell you from personal experience, even in my home, we had a bill of about 22,000 rupees for electricity. We put in the solar panels in 2016, and now that bill is about 1,000 rupees. So a saving of about 21,000 rupees. And this is what we should be looking at going forward in terms of harnessing the sun and reforesting every green space that is available. So let's talk a little about why creating science-led leadership is important. Gone are the days that future leaders should be appointed if they are ignorant of science or ignoring science. Now, I'm not saying that every leader in the future has to have a degree in science, but there's a big difference between having a degree in science and respecting science and honoring science. That is what we are talking about here. And that is the kind of leader that should be given national leadership or business leadership in the future, because ignoring science will no longer be accepted will be not accepted for any leader in any situation. The sun. So let me share with you a simple fact about the sun. That's why I believe the Creator did not put the sun there by chance. If we harness the sun produces enough energy every 88 minutes to power the entire planet. So the entire planet's energy requirements can be powered by the sun if we harness it. And every 88 minutes, the sun is giving the planet enough energy to operate with only the sun. And there's a little inset there I have put down in Africa. That big red box is the amount of space we need to cover in the Sahara Desert to power the entire planet with solar power. We require only 1.2% of the Sahara Desert to power the entire planet with solar power and batteries. And it gives you how much we need to cover Europe and how much we need to cover Asia and Africa. Today, Sri Lanka is 30% driven by renewables, 70% driven by fossil fuels. We need to make that shift, and making that shift from 1% of solar power, we need to move that up to at least 50-60%, because we have the power of the sun working for us. And now we have amazing renewable energy sources available that are operating and impacting the planet today. The best bit of news I can share with you is in the last 5 years, between 70 and 80% of all new energy capacity was solar, wind, and geothermal. So renewables are beginning to now have a major impact and are moving in the right direction. So what else can we do? I think we should be looking at every church building and also encouraging our parishioners to look at moving into renewables, moving at least into solar and battery as an option. And I can tell you the renewables today have become cheaper than fossil fuels because of the new developments that are happening in the world today. Number two, we should be maximizing our green spaces in our church lands. Last but not least, make the church a zero single-use plastic facility. And everything I have said here today is relevant to every school we have here represented. There is absolutely no reason why school roofs cannot be utilized to move into renewable energy sources. And who knows? I'm aware of 2 universities in Europe which have moved into renewable energy, and the savings that they've got from that has gone into much better pay for the professors teaching there and also the facilities that those universities have. Every school should be looking at these 3 issues also. Because finally, we must remember the future, it belongs to all of you. And I want to end with another small clip which talks of how the next 100 years will pan out if we ignore what we are hearing today versus what it can be if we do something about it. I don't want to depress all of you, but I can tell you that there is an option away from all of this. And I sincerely hope that we look at the option that we have. In closing, I want to share with you today that my intention was to create awareness of the climate emergency amongst all of us. And I hope that has been done. Number 2 was to make sure that all of you know what is causing the climate emergency. Number 3, the actions we need to take to move away from fossil fuels into renewable sources. All of you remember, during World War II, Hiroshima was devastated by atomic bombs. And people thought that Hiroshima and Nagasaki will never ever resuscitate and be natural again. But believe it or not, today, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are thriving nature resorts. The reason I'm sharing this thought with you is that we can destroy the planet. But actually, the only thing that will happen is we will destroy ourselves. The planet will go on for billions of years more. It is humanity that will not be there. And as I look around, there are quite a few of you who are young, who have 20, 30 years ahead of you, 40, 50 years ahead of you, 60, 70 years ahead of you. If you want to do something about securing your future, then I hope today you have learned something important that will be a key subject that you need to be looking at. Because tomorrow will belong to those who do something about tomorrow today. So should the church respond? I hope I have answered that without too much detail. And can the church be part of the solution? Yes. The nation has committed to getting to 70% renewables, and every business, every government institution, and the churches, and every religious institution should also be part of this. And I hope that these messages will resonate with you in the future. Thank you very much for your time.